thank everybody for being here today. I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Andrew Reeves. I'm a professor of political science and I'm the director of the Weidenbaum Center. Thank you all so much for being here today. I also want to thank Peter Baumgarten and the business school for co-sponsoring this event and letting us see, how the other half live here in the business school. $100 bills under your seats. No, thank you very much for that. And I look forward to more collaborations with the business school going forward. So today our guest speaker is Nate Jensen. Nate Jensen is a professor in the Department of Government at the University of Texas in Austin. He earned his PhD from Yale in 2002. Nate was previously an associate professor in the Department of International Business at George Washington University from 2014 to 2016. Before that, Nate was an associate professor in the political science department right here at Washington University in St. Louis. He also advertises that he is an NFL owner. So if you have any questions about that, he has one share of the Green Bay Packers. So, if we just want to scrap this talk and talk about that, we can. Today, Nate is really one of the foremost experts on the relationship between local communities, businesses, and how they try to bring business in through incentives. I was just flipping through your book. The opening example, in fact, is about a border war. And that war is between Kansas City, the city, and Kansas, the state. And so, his research really sheds light on big, important questions in political science, but also very practical questions around sort of the value of incentives and what the political benefits are from them. So in addition to all of us here, we have a number of folks joining us on Zoom. For those of you that are on Zoom, thank you for joining us. The chat is or should be open, and please feel free to type any questions that you might have for those of you that are on Zoom into the chat, and we'll be sure to get those questions answered when the Q&A comes. For those of us in the room, you can just raise your hand and we'll do it that way. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Nate Jensen.
Thank you. So thank you for the invitation here. Also, I was a Weidenbaum Center fellow. So a lot of the research that I've talked about here was funded by the Weidenbaum Center. It was shopped in Weidenbaum Center events. I chatted with Murray Weidenbaum a bunch of times about some of this research. So, this is also kind of I'm happy to come back and see friends, but it's a thank you as well, that a lot of this research was made possible by being here at WashU, but also the opening introduction is I started getting interested in this topic by looking at what was happening in Kansas City. So I was a foreign direct investment person thinking about negotiations between governments and firms abroad. And then I shifted some of my research to say, well, these same dynamics are very interesting at the state and often at the local level. So we can talk about St. Louis and the negotiations between companies. The one apology I should make is that that's not really an accurate title, but it's all in bold and all caps, so maybe that's a bad title, but it's all $100 billion. We actually don't know the amount of money spent every year on economic development, mostly because a lot of it's off budget, right? And this is TIFs in St. Louis, right? And there's a 2020 state audit report saying this either it's not reported or it's underreported. So even the dollar aggregate amount per year, we don't know what that amount. And that's going to come back later in the talk because quite a bit of the talk is about, this is a public facing talk, there's underlying research behind it, but I'm going to tell some stories and talk through how these kind of examples fit into existing research. And one of the big pieces, one of the big puzzles is why is there such a lack of transparency in this economic policy area? But also what's kind of interesting is it's also very public in a different way. And I wanted to show you very quickly, like I have a book with a co-author and we picked between two covers. And this is the actual cover. And this is President Donald Trump at a carrier factory. I don't know if people remembered this. This is very early in his presidency, that he was saving a carrier plant from being outsourced to Mexico. And they had relocation plans in place. And there was a negotiation. And Donald Trump didn't have any money directly. He helped broker a deal between the state and carrier. The bad news is carrier ended up cutting most of the jobs and moving many of the operations anyways. But the story is this picture, right? And that's what I'm trying to explain in this talk, that an economic development, set of economic development policies that are generally discredited by much of the academic literature are very popular with politicians. And why is that? And this alternative is, does anyone see who this is here in the center? It's Terry McAuliffe, the governor of Virginia. The press thought no one would know who that was, so that's why even though the big check was even a better example. And turns out this is very similar to Missouri. This is actually a fraudulent company. It was a Chinese company that had some claims about factory capacity, that their financials, that the ability to deliver on this investment, and it fell apart. This is very similar to Moberly, Missouri, Mamtech, which again, a Chinese sweetener company that made these big promises. The city raised bonds and almost went bankrupt, right? Because of this. Turns out they got their money back. But the point is, like, again, for this study is to think about, this is very different from the idea of like under the table deals towards businesses. This is a very public, right? A very public exchange and very public credit claiming by politicians. And that's really the focus of the talk here. I'm going to talk about some of the academic research and why these programs aren't particularly good. But a lot of what I'm going to talk about is why do we see the persistence in programs that have been discredited by academics, but also many of the own state auditors and state evaluations, that these same evaluations come back negative. So that's the real quick structure of the talk. What are economic development incentives? Do they work? The answer is generally no, although there are best practices, but often the best practices are very different from the policies being enacted by cities, states, and increasingly the federal government. And then why do politicians use them? So that's the quick structure of the talk. And I thought rather than like boring you with data, let's bore you with some pictures. And some of the pictures, the top two are where I live in Austin, Texas. The far top is Samsung. And this is a huge deal. In 2001, Samsung relocated or actually opened a brand new factory, greenfield production in Austin area, just north of where I live. It's a big deal because they had no other major manufacturing facilities in Texas. It's high quality jobs. It's pretty clean, although they did have a water pollution spill. They use a lot of water. That fountain is now turned off, even though they use millions of gallons of water. They use a lot of water and power, so that's the negative. But it tends to be good jobs, and they actually import a lot of their raw materials, which isn't a lot, but they export everything out of Austin. So they're not competing with any other local businesses. So it's unlike a retail, right, where you're cannibalizing. This is what you want, right? This is exactly what you want. And this is 2001. So the only negative is they received the full suite of economic development incentives. They've got cash grants from the state, tax abatements from the city, tax abatements from the county, sales tax abatements, a whole suite of different economic development incentives that were all 10-year programs. Right, and the logic was we want jobs, but actually this is capital intensive investment. I did a tour, there aren't that many people, but there's a lot of capital that's gonna eventually go on your tax rolls. The problem is year 9 of their abatement, they reinvested and got a new 10-year abatement. So this is 2010, 2020, and now they proposed a series of new investments, a massive expansion of their investments, and they asked for a new suite of incentives. The real negative story for the Austin area is that they threatened to relocate. And they threatened to relocate not to another country. They threatened to not even another state, another part of the Austin metro area. This is Taylor, Texas. And there's a big New York Times story about this. It's going to be a massive semiconductor investment, but they played the city of Austin against Taylor, Texas. The city of Austin was actually, honestly, some of the city council were shocked. Like, this is a company that's been here for, we've given them everything for 20 years. And now they're finally coming on the tax rolls with a new expansion, and they're asking for this step. So even this, positive story has some real negative consequences. And in the end, this investment that we've given 20 years of subsidies to is largely moving to another part of the Austin metro area. Okay, I'll be quick. I know these stories maybe take a while. Gigafactory, that's Tesla. What's interesting about this, again, the Austin area has largely stopped giving out economic development incentives. And it's, if anything, we've got the prosperity bomb. Homelessness, housing prices, tech is coming anyways, right? So a lot of the pivot of our economic development has been on the creative arts, services, thinking about different ways to think about economic development. So much so that the city didn't offer Tesla anything. And our county had put a pause, a memorandum, moratorium on offering any incentives. And they lifted it for Tesla. So Tesla came, said, we want, within a month, we're deciding between Tulsa, Oklahoma, or we're gonna decide to go to Austin. And they lifted the moratorium. What's interesting about this again is that, I was telling Matt Gobble this, the jobs look that they pay about $17, $18 an hour, which is our local fast food restaurants are about 17, 16. I think the zoo is what you said, $14.50 an hour. So the quality of the jobs, right? The quality of the jobs was not what you normally expect in auto production. So often the calculus of what kind of factories do you want to attract? You want to attract high-paying auto jobs. The other is the supply chains are very different for EVs, right? And that's an important point as well. So the spillovers of economic development, this kind of project is lower than the traditional auto investment. So the point is like, now Tesla, to their credit, they're actually investing in lithium mining in Texas, but that's coming subsidized. There's gonna be another expansion, but also subsidies. So the point is that, the idea that these things will pay for themselves as the subsidies run out, at least these two examples are classic examples of, no, you go back to the negotiation table. And even the quality of what you get, again, the jobs, is pretty low. And the other irony, and we'll talk about this later, is so when you give property tax abatements, you lowered the cost of capital, but you didn't lower the cost of labor. So this is what we call robot incentives. So it's actually further encouraging the use of automation in these factories, which are all very high in Tesla. So the point is, if this is a job creation strategy, boy, that's not a very good strategy at all. Okay, I'll go very quickly. This is Kansas. This is a rendering of the Panasonic EV battery plant. This made the news because there was special legislation enacted in Kansas around this without the name of the company. And the legislature did not know what company was coming. They just knew the industry, and they signed non-disclosure agreements. So the few legislators that did know the company name were not allowed to reveal it, right? So they had to make this blind decision of giving hundreds of millions of dollars of incentives without knowing what the factory is. There's also non-disclosure agreements on the performance. So how many jobs did they actually create? So again, it's a great production facility to attract. Again, you're thinking of the future, it actually fits very nicely within the Kansas economy, but you gave a lot away, including good governance. This is HQ2. You might have seen the news. This is in Virginia, but St. Louis put a bid in. 238 cities also put in bids. So there's competition over HQ2. That's a rendering again, still not built. They haven't been paid any of their incentives because they haven't created the jobs yet. So it looks like 2026. So there's this crazy competition for Amazon HQ2, but in the end, we still don't know, right, what the final outcome is going to be. And then finally, my home state of Wisconsin, that's Foxconn, which is one of the notorious kind of economic development deals that fell apart. My family's particularly upset about some parts of this because they used eminent domain to take land from farmers. So you took people's land, and then there's a deal that fell apart. They also had special exemptions on wetlands. So they got special rules on environmental policy, which again, the environmental. Okay, so these are negative stories. I'll be perfectly honest here, right? I'm giving you a sense of what we're talking about in economic development incentives. We're talking about targeted incentives to single firms. We're not talking about taxes. We're talking about, in particular, targeted programs towards large firms, often in the form of tax abatements, but we're going to talk about some other forms as well. Okay, so that's the long-winded, kind of picture story. Let me give you the quick nerd overview. What does the academic research look like? And the quick nerd overview is that Tim Bartek, who's at the Upjohn Institute, did a meta-analysis, right? So a study of studies and looking at what do all the academic studies on economic development incentives, what did they find? And the question is, how many of these firms would have come anyways without incentives? And the finding is between 75% to 98%. of firms. So most firms getting an economic development incentive were coming anyways. The joke is like you decide where you want to go and then you tell your tax department to get the best deal possible. Now, this doesn't mean that they don't all, right? That there aren't cases of firms that were really making these decisions. But again, the academic research shows, I mean, and we know what kind of firms that are geographically constrained. This is oil and gas in Texas, right? They are much less likely to be mobile, but also expansions. When Samsung, that first Samsung, I honest to God believe they could have gone somewhere else. But once they were there and they asked for another 10-year expansion, that's where this literature says it's probably coming anyways and you're burning dollars for nothing. And I did a bunch of studies, a bunch of different states. Maybe the simplest one to explain is Kansas. You know, again, there was some data collection, but the most obvious was I just surveyed the firms that got incentives. I literally asked the firms. And Kansas gave me the list of all the firms and the emails of the people who applied for it. And I simply asked them, even knowing that there's going to be bias in these answers, right? Would you have come without this incentive? And 2/3 of the firms said they would have come anyways. So they're just cashing the check. Okay, what's the point here? Even if, you know, baseball, you don't have to hit 100%, right, to be a great player. So maybe these, even if only some of these are landing, right, the returns are so large. But most of the economic development research, again, says the cost is like $1.5 million per job. You're spending so much money on these incentives per job that it's really rare for this to pan out. Okay, so what's the story here is like, I'm telling you a story that the academics are saying these programs, in particular tax abatements, are bad public policy. Why do politicians use it? And maybe the answer is politicians don't believe these stories or they don't know them. So I'm going to show you a little more evidence. This is a state evaluation of film incentives. A bunch of states are actually re-talking. New Mexico is trying to re-up their film incentive program. Bunch of states Iowa had a big collapse in there due to a corruption scandal and then discussions about bringing it back. What did the study say? And this is from Pennsylvania's study, and they actually were really good with their research. They actually cited the other state studies. So this is just a summary of what other states other than Pennsylvania found. And what's the key here? State return on investment. So for every dollar that you spend on a film incentive, how much does the state get back, right? And that number is like 6 cents, 10 cents, 8 cents. And this is using the heroic assumption that every single one of these films that's getting an incentive is only coming because of the incentive. So if you cut the incentive program, no films get, right? Which is not true, right? Actually, California did a study, they do a lottery, right? So not every film who applies for incentives gets incentives. A lot of films came anyways, even without incentives. But even using that heroic assumption, these never make money, right? And it's in some sense obvious, right? You film a film and Tom Cruise shows up for a brief period of time and then he leaves, right? And yes, there's some additional economic activity around it, but it's pretty small. And it's transient, right? They're going to jump to another state with better incentives. What's the point here? Again, these are own state agencies. We can go across different types of programs and show their own state agencies are showing them that these programs don't work. Again, I could bring from Texas, I could bring from Kansas. Kansas just had a legislative audit, right? So there's a lot of evidence that at least within the state, they understand. And then what's the final one? The final one is like, maybe these politicians are just reading the news, right? And there's enough of these news stories, and this Applebee's is the Kansas City border war. And again, I'm not sure how much you guys all followed this, right? But companies will jump back and forth across Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas City, Kansas, and get counted as a new investment. Literally move 4 miles that direction, you get a 10-year tax abatement. You move 4 miles back 10 years later, you get another one. And that's what Applebee's did. They went back and forth until they moved to California. The point is like, this is so institutionalized. There are consultants that buy lease expiration data. So when a law firm's lease is expiring, you call them up and say, hey, you're in Kansas City, Missouri. There's an office building I'll broker for you and I'll do the paperwork and get you your incentives. And we take 30%. And this is the common, again, and it's so well known that the Hallmark family, the Hall Family Foundation, local businesses stood up and said, we have to end this. And again, if you follow this, there's a brokered piece for the economic, but this went on for decades, right? So you have to know as a politician that this firm literally just moved a couple miles. And I lived in Silver Spring, Missouri, and the same thing with a couple corporate headquarters that moved from one city to another and claiming it's new. The workers aren't moving. They literally moved 2 miles, right? So again, the point is politicians know this. This is a scandal from New Jersey, a whistleblower scandal, where they found that someone, was getting passed up for promotion. So they told all the stories of what was going on. And the stories were in New Jersey. For the academics in the room, how do you get a pay raise? You get an outside offer, right? In New Jersey, to get an economic development incentive, you have to show you have a credible outside offer. So one consultant put the same address for every single application. There's one location in New York. And okay, that's crazy. But what's crazy is they have the minutes where the actual Economic Development Authority knew it. And they would just roll their eyes as there it is again. That's that crappy office building. And then they went back to that office building and they had never talked to any of these folks. So it was completely made up, right? The point is, like, the Economic Development Agency knew what was going on. And here's the dirty secret of this. Their Economic Development Agency was what's called self-funded. So the more incentives they gave out, the more money they got in revenues. Again, this is St. Louis, right? This is actually how St. Louis has worked in terms of economic development. The point is, like, you had built this institution that was in the business of throwing money out the door in a way that was millions and millions of dollars, right, of economic development that caused a major scandal. And they're rewriting these. They actually got also, again, it's an incredible scandal where they actually got the Word document where the lobbyists changed, like we're literally writing, they got the track changes for the lobbyists. So it's a multiple dimension complex scandal, but for our purposes, they knew, right, that these companies weren't going elsewhere. And then this is the last one, this is from my own research. Our major tax abatement program started in 2001. And this is what's called Chapter 313 in Texas. And it was this idea that Boeing and Intel had passed up Texas because Texas, we don't have an income tax, but we have very high property taxes. So it's really hard for capital intensive manufacturing to make it work, right? Or at least that's the narrative, right? That it's very, very expensive for capital intensive. So we got to give them a break. So the very first applicant was Dow Chemical. And in their application, there's this little footnote. They admitted they started building already. So they applied after they built their operation. And then they had another footnote, I couldn't fit on here, another footnote that said, by the way, those 600 jobs, we're actually cutting another Texas factory and we're just transferring people. So it's no new jobs. Again, what's the point here? Like, it's an interesting story, but that is in the public record, right? That is the comptroller's office documents, that they are the ones authorizing these incentives. Now, just so you don't think I'm like making fun of, Dow Chemical, the craziest story is this economic development program, which again is kind of weird, has renewable energy in it along with the oil and gas, right? Again, maybe, I don't know if that sounds weird. Actually, a lot of the oil and gas own the renewable energy assets, but the point is you have these very different programs. So there's a wind farm that was built, and I think they just had bad consultants because this is a give me. You get these incentives no matter what. And the wind farm applied. For some reason, the school district who had to vote on it never voted, and they built it. And 3 years later, they sold this wind farm to JD Power. And JD Power said, I wonder if we can get those incentives. So I found the application, and literally this is what it looks like. They like just axe out, and they changed the deadline to 3 years. And then they're in their application, they had clearly their lawyers say, technically, here's the rules. The rules are you have to apply before you build. And that was an application, right? This is just a modified application, but we really did apply in 2003 and they got their economic development incentives. So am I overdoing it here? The point is it's an open secret, right? The emperor has no clothes. And what I find interesting is then why are people signing off on this? And again, for the economic development agencies, right, that are getting money for as much, but we also have mayors and city councils and governors supporting these programs. Sorry, was there a question? Yeah.
Just one quick question. So go back to the slide that's tied towards the ROI in the film industry.
Yeah, sure.
Do you have a sense on industry variance in terms of an estimated ROI? So again, I'm just guessing here, or maybe just hypothesizing. Imagine that a film, it's hard to imagine other people coming in to the region in order to spend in the restaurants locally, other than the folks that are there for a bit. If you had something like a stadium or something, maybe there's an argument that there's more positive externalities that go into the broader community.
Yeah.
Maybe not to the point of an ROI of $1 on $1, but do you have a sense on what might explain some of the variance in ROI and whether or not we know what causes that variance?
Yeah, great question. Although you did pick up the other bad example, right? Actually, sports stadiums, there's some economists who said the average NFL stadium generates the same amount of economic activity as a Target, right? Or a Walmart. And it's the point is like, it's only open for 7 or 8 games, right? Maybe 9 games if you go to the playoffs, right? You have multi-purpose stadiums, but the economic development impact. So that's one point. It's like, what are the jobs creation? What are the supply chains? So this is some of the worst, right? And that's honestly the film industry. We could talk a little bit about best practices, but best practices are more mobile, like businesses, honest to God, that are more mobile, but actually targeting small firms. There's much higher returns to small firms, and in particular, capitally constrained small firms. So small firms that don't have access to capital. And this is, everything from microfinance in the developing world to possible discrimination in lending markets, right? These are the kind of programs. So I'm happy to come back to that if it answers, but this is honestly like this, and sports stadiums are the worst, which is weird. There's a bunch of NFL stadiums aging, and I thought the stadium subsidy wars were over, and here they are again. So good questions. Does anyone else have any other questions? Because what I wanted to pivot to, hopefully I didn't make that too strong of a case, but at least we know that there are individual projects within these programs that everyone knows are a stinker, right? And everyone knows it. And what's interesting to me is then why do politicians sign off on this? And maybe that seems obvious to some of you, but a lot of the existing research had talked about capture. It's the role of special interests, which I don't dispute. Although we did some research and couldn't at least find a link between campaign contributions and incentives. Why? Because even those politicians without campaign contributions were still given incentives. We actually found this really strong pattern of incumbents sign off on incentives, and it's pretty persistent. So that's why there's not as much variation. Again, there's a lot of power, of possible corruption. But again, think of that picture of the check, right? Usually you try to hide the money that you're exchanging, right? And the idea that the fact that every governor, just go to a governor's office when they announce an economic development deal, they tend to announce the amount of money the state gave. So there's something publicly valuable in that. And that's where my research came in. And the idea is that this is one of the most effective ways for a politician to claim credit. So there are so few levers you can pull as a mayor or a governor that actually shows people you generated jobs, not in the future, but like now, before re-election. Like think about and I actually asked, I was doing all this work, statistical work, and I joked, an economic developer is like, you should just see my inbox. The governor's office before the election says, show me some deals, right? Deliver me some wins. And these are ribbon cutting ceremonies. And they're actually literally in the contract in the Texas Enterprise Fund. They're in the contract that you're not allowed to talk about the incentives you get until the governor signs off on it. The governor wants to announce, right, on the incentives, and then they have a ribbon cutting ceremony as well. So the point is that at least this logic could be very different, right? If it's what the politicians are doing, even if they know they're not good, they know the company's coming anyways, that this is how they take credit for that investment. And then we do within this, again, partially funded by the Weidenbaum Center, a number of surveys across countries, across states over time. And we find this systematic pattern of voters reward politicians for bringing investment with an incentive. Again, you'd probably think it'd be the opposite. We should get investment for free, right? But the idea that the politician then isn't the one who did something to land that investment, right? So that's the basic, and again, I'm happy to talk about this in a lot more detail, but what's newer stuff that I've been working on, which hopefully is interesting, so you have this really public, let's have a big check signing ceremony. Literally, there's what's called a big check signing ceremony in Texas, and you sign up for it when you get an incentive. But at the same time, I told you that Panasonic story where they took the name off of Panasonic. They signed all these non-disclosure agreements. If you try to get the Amazon HQ2 bids for a number of cities, including my own in Austin, you can't get them. You petition for details on on Georgia film incentives. You can't get the data. It's actually housed, it's confidential tax data. So there's both this really public aspect, but a non-transparent aspect. And sort of the joke is what are they hiding exactly? Does anyone know the Barbra Streisand effect? Have you heard this before? Barbra Streisand didn't want helicopters flying over her compound in LA. And then everyone's like, what the hell is she hiding? And then helicopters started flying over, right? Well, this is a little bit like the research that I was conducting. So I actually looked at the Texas Enterprise Fund, which is our biggest economic development program in terms of a cash grant. It's actually the envy of many other states because it's so big, right? It's like what's called a deal closing fund or quick action fund. So a company gets all these different incentives, but the governor can come with a check. And it's literally the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the Speaker of the House signs off on it. So that's all. You can move quickly and you give cash to a company. And it's in Texas, under the Perry administration, they didn't even have contracts. They negotiated and talked to the companies, and then there was a scandal. And now it's been much more institutionalized where there are formal applications, and then there's a contract. And then there's some amount, some money goes upfront right away, and then as you create jobs, you get more money. So it's this very institutionalized program. And I thought, you know, this would be an interesting research project. I'm gonna look at what they applied, what they said in their application, and then what was the contract? And then did they deliver on it? Can I get secondary data? And it turns out the data never came along. The data is, again, confidential data at the Texas Labor. I tried to petition as a UT faculty and I could never get data. So, okay, so that part fell apart. But what was interesting is that, you know, some of you know my wife, Sophie, she was going to the mail, right? And this is in Austin. And she walks outside and then comes in with this look on her face and she's like, what the hell did you do? And I was like, what do you mean, what did I do? And she's like, why is SpaceX and Apple legal departments sending letters to our home address? And I was like, okay, here's what happened. I put in a public records request asking for these applications and for the contracts. So what did they promise up front? And then what was written in the contract? And what happened, and this is in many states, companies can challenge these requests. In Texas, it's really, really anti-journalist and pro-business, where first of all, you put in a public records request that affects a company and they alert the company. There's been a public records request, Tesla, SpaceX, for this economic. So this drives journalists crazy because it tells them that they're working on a story. The company also then has 30 days to challenge that ruling, meaning again, you're a journalist, okay, don't write a story that's going to be timely, right? 30 days. Then they challenge it, and then the Attorney General's office makes a ruling on it, and then writes up the ruling and send it. So months go by when I had put this public records request in, and then the mailbox shows up, and my wife is like, "What's going on here?" And these companies challenge our public records requests, and this is the Barbara Streisand effect. I was like, "Ooh, what are they hiding? Like, what do we think is in there?" And I know this has been a long talk, so I can go through this pretty quickly. But the point is that we found 42 out of the 165 companies challenge our public records request. By the way, these aren't free. There's $1,200 for this request. I was like, literally, these are just like a bunch of documents, right? Again, the journalist drives journalists crazy that there are all these barriers to getting these contracts, but we have legal challenges to these requests. What's interesting is, like, in the end, the companies won to some extent. So a bunch of the companies said, we don't want any of our trade secrets, so we don't want any description of the investment, blah, blah, blah. So these are just redacted. But a bunch of them said, we don't want them to know anything about employment. Our competitors then can see what our plans are for employment, what our salaries, redacted. So that, does it make sense? The application that they put in was heavily redacted. I couldn't really get too much out of it. And then there's contracts. And the contracts came in without redactions because it's a state contract. And what's interesting is, like, the contracts kind of fit the ribbon cutting ceremony. We promised 400 jobs at an average wage of $60,000, blah, blah, blah. And that's what the contract looked like. What we didn't expect was that a bunch of the companies had second, third, or fourth contracts, amended contracts, right? And it turns out the companies that had these amended contracts were actually much more likely to challenge our public records requests. And, like, what are these amendments, right? And again, I know this is a long talk, so I won't go too much longer, but we grouped them in like 4 different types. One is like technical, which is basically a story like, I don't know what's going on. Some of them were like joint ventures, and they said, we changed our technology, blah, blah, blah. We want to amend our contract. Some of them had really complicated stories about how the employment of different subsidiaries is going to work. I couldn't fully figure out whether it was like something real or something, we're getting out of job creation, but the rest of them were all about the jobs, right? And a bunch of them was job targets. So the day before, and maybe I could explain this quickly, the Texas Enterprise Fund, if you don't deliver the jobs that you promised, you got to give the money back. And that goes on a website. So journalists watch that website and say, SpaceX failed, right? So it's a big deal. It's probably more than the money is the actual negative press from failing. So companies want to avoid this. So what we found in this, a bunch of companies the day before they're due to report jobs, they got a 2-year extension. So the professor's in the room again, give me an extension, right? 2 years, 4-year extension. Some companies got multiple extensions. This is never publicized. Okay, and maybe, I mean, this wasn't, you can imagine during COVID or the Great Recession, maybe there's good reasons behind that. But again, it was not public. And then we found a bunch that changed the jobs, changed the number of jobs. We had a bunch that changed how many jobs, like we'll actually create half the jobs we promised and we get half the incentives, but some generated half the jobs and got 75% incentives. The point is there's these changes in the jobs, either when you're going to deliver the jobs or how many, but actually the kind of the wildest ones are like, I don't know, changing what the definition of a job is, right? And some of them are literally, we're going to start counting contractors. Some of them actually change their numbers of how many, so you had 1,000 jobs and now you're going to add 500 jobs and they go back and say, actually, you only had 800 jobs and you have to add 500. Does that make sense? You basically lower the initial jobs. The craziest one is Comerica Bank. Do you guys know Comerica Bank? They promised an average wage, a mean wage, and clearly they couldn't deliver because they had, we're going to generate this number 100 jobs at $50,000 a year. They added their CEO and a bunch of their executive salaries. So they moved, that's how they made it. The day before, again, this is the Carolina Panthers did this as well in their practice facility. They put their players' salaries on. So it's like, we've got a practice facility that makes, creates jobs at $1.5 million a year. It's like, that's Cam Newton's salary in there, right? The point is like, what's interesting to me here, and I'll wrap up here very quickly. What's interesting to me here is like, what's this duality of we have these very, very public kind of wins, but then once we get into the details, there's clawbacks, there's all this different governance of these programs. One, it's not in the interest of the governor to admit a mistake or a mayor to admit a mistake or the company. So these quiet amendments in particular are really kind of powerful. I'm going to skip here and just say 2 things. St. Louis, right? I gave these stories and you guys are like, these are kind of wild stories. He's cherry picking. This is literally the table of contents from the 2020 audit of TIFs in St. Louis, right? You need to plan better. You better cost control. You need to actually evaluate these projects in a way that's credible. Developer profits not monitored. Fee structure creates the appearance of conflict of interest, means that they make money for the more TIFs they give out. You self-finance. Again, some of you in the room already know this, but this is literally the table of contents, right, for the 2020 audit. Now, I know there's been revisions to TIFs in St. Louis, but my concern is that underlying logic still, right? It's a credit claiming device and you don't want to look bad. So that's been the problem where a lot of times there'll be clawbacks or changes to the governance, but the enforcement is optional, or you have the ability to amend contracts. That's St. Louis. Let's go real quickly. Final slide here. Federal government. Inflation Reduction Act. A bunch of the features of the Inflation Reduction Act, I have all these same problems that I talked about, right? And again, we could talk about a bunch, like the tax abatements are uncapped. If you want to know, like try to find good research on production tax credits for wind. It's confidential IRS data. There's almost no scholarly work on that. You can't get the data. There's no transparency provisions in this. Best practices at state and local economic development, you have a 10-year program with a sunset and evaluation the year before. You build and evaluate. There's no evaluations in here. And there's actually the opposite of a sunset. If the US doesn't actually make a number of benchmarks, these programs continue. So meaning like if the US doesn't transition to alternate renewable energy fast enough, the programs that failed to deliver stay in place, right? So again, this isn't, you can imagine lots of reasons why this structure popped up like this, but it's really curious. And the worst one, which I cannot make any sense of is, and this is, I swear, my last point here, can't make any sense of is the idea, like if you're gonna give a firm an incentive, give a firm an incentive. Give it directly to the firm. And the point is like, this is film incentives, right? So a lot of these film production companies, they don't have any tax liability. Literally, you film a commercial on the WashU campus and you get some incentive, right? And it's a tax abatement. So what a number of states have done is some have said, too bad. right? Either you have tax liability or you don't. Almost all states make a different choice. And that choice is one of two. You can go back to the treasury and get your money. So it's as good as cash, right? This was the original idea between underlying a bunch of the IRA provisions, that you are a small renewable energy company and you get 20% on your investment tax abatement, and you go to the US government and you get that cash. They changed it, right? And they've done what some states have done in the film industry, where you have to sell it off to someone else. It's called a transferable credit. And again, you guys are looking like, what's the big deal? Transferable credit means you're gonna need a broker, you need a lawyer, you have to transfer it out, and you take a haircut on that. So if you're a wind developer and you have $100 million in tax credits, you don't sell that for $100 million, right? You sell it off some cut. The point is, like, there's a bunch of firms in film, new market tax credits, a whole bunch of these programs that are the brokers. They are some of the strongest lobbyists. They were just in Texas actually lobbying for a program, trying to make the programs transferable. So you basically created the turbo tax of economic development by doing this. Again, these are the same features, some of the same problems of other economic development programs. Okay, I know that's a lot all at once, and let me just give my final conclusion. And what's the point? Hopefully, like, I made the point that these programs are problematic, at least, you know, some of the types of programs. Happy to talk about which ones work better. There's evidence that politicians either know or they should know, right? Given their state agencies, right? Given the capacity of some of these programs. But our work is about elected officials, and elected officials taking credit. And again, you can change the rules. You can, on the margins, change these programs. But often it's still the same problem, right? It's still this incentive to credit claim. And then the last part is, and the interesting part is, the lack of transparency makes it difficult to criticize these programs. So that even though I can find through public records requests, right, there's a narrative that these programs pay for themselves. There's a narrative that this company generated these jobs, when in fact, when we investigate, we don't find that. Okay, so I know that was a little over time. Happy to take questions. Thank you.
I'm gonna come with a mic.
Is that too negative, by the way? This is, you know.
No, it was not too negative. Thank you so much for your talk and for your work. I'm very, very grateful for it. I want to add one more case study. So just last week at the Board of Aldermen here in St. Louis, the board passed a 10-year tax abatement for the Albion Tower, which is a 30-story luxury residential, plan with amenities like a pool and something called a stargazing room and like a spin room and yoga. And I like your term heroic incentives. The assumptions around with the financial analysis suggested that on this site, which is very close to here in the Central West End, like some of the hottest real estate in the city, that nothing would happen there but for this tax abatement, basically rewarding speculation. And the alderperson who introduced this legislation, who was not the alderperson whose ward it's in, who's sitting to my left, did receive money from the lobbyist for the developer. And we have all this new language in St. Louis around an economic justice plan. It's SLDC, our development corporation. And yet this is happening. It's on the mayor's desk now. It hasn't been signed, but it's like another kind of, in my opinion, like worst case scenario. And as a resident of St. Louis and as a St. Louis public schools parent, like my head is going to explode. And I want this to be an open secret, like how much these incentives do not work in the public interest, but I don't think that it is. I think that this narrative you ended with about that they pay for themselves, because our financial analyses make these ridiculous assumptions about what would happen, but for the incentives, I think some people do believe those. So my question is, how do we build a base around this issue? Because it's very wonky. Academics might know that this is, that they don't work in terms of the public's interest, but ordinary taxpayers, ordinary people don't speak the language of incentives. Like you start talking about this stuff and people's eyes glaze over. So my question is like, in places that you've seen reform happen, like with Austin creating a moratorium, how does that kind of political will get organized? Like, how do you communicate this to ordinary people?
Yeah, so this is a good, and it's a hard question. I mean, because one thing that it's someone who works in this space, an activist told me, you're never going to win on a deal by deal basis. So we had a sports stadium in Austin that had this kind of very complicated incentive structure. And the team had this whole group of people. The only people who are against it is actually our F1 racetrack, because it was a convening venue. So occasionally you'll get other companies, but usually you're all alone, right? You're all alone against well-paid developers or business interests. So one is rules, right? Better rules on these programs. So like if I could magic wand, like if you could just turn it from a 10-year to a 5-year abatement, you'd still have all the nastiness, but you just cut the costs, right? So there's ways that in which you can hand tie. You can also delay, you require public hearings. And a lot of these projects are done at really, really like fast, with limits public scrutiny. But honestly, some of the companies want to make these decisions fast. They honestly got, so you force their hand. Either you get incentives and you wait 6 months, or you build without incentives. So that's the structural. The one kind of crazy thing in Texas, I never thought this would happen. There's a big grassroots organization, and it's a religious set of religious groups, non-denominational religious groups, who fought tax abatements in Louisiana. And then they moved to Texas, and they've been incredibly influential because they get the parishioners from the communities that are asking the abatements. These are rural areas, right, for oil and gas. These are rural areas maybe with wind and solar. And they're nonpartisan. They're incredibly well organized, literally like John Stewart actually had one of them on, a priest, and they show up at every public hearing. And they're at school boards, and they're their consistent voice. And again, I was a little skeptical, like, I don't know if it's going to matter. And a bunch of school districts rejected these incentives on these pleas, saying, not only do they not work, that you're hurting children, right? And you're hurting. The way that Texas program is, it comes out of the school pot. So you're actually abating money from other school districts. And they just said, don't do this. We're your allies. We support school bonds. We do everything for you, say no. And my school district, Austin Independent School District, rejected a semiconductor because of that. So there are some of these examples, but I do think, again, the structural problem is politicians want to give them, and most of the average citizens, right, are too busy to show up at a hearing in the middle of the day. So it's mostly paid interest. Yeah, good question.
I'm not sure if I can formulate this question in a coherent way, but I'll take a try at it. It seems like a lot of the press that I read sort of indicates that the political power of incentives may not be as great as politicians think that it is. I mean, on the federal level, it didn't seem like there was much of a murmur when child tax incentives expired and other things in the American Rescue Plan. Like, it didn't seem like there was a lot of political credit for that kind of thing. However, the politicians with these tax abatements you described obviously believe there is. So I'm wondering what evidence actually exists about the political efficacy of being the guy who stands up saying, here's the check and we're subsidizing a business. Because it doesn't seem like it has that power when it's more of a subsidy to individuals or so on, at least not in red states.
Yeah, interesting. So I don't know, I guess there's multiple parts of that question, but one is, the key is the credit claiming aspect. So this is where sometimes the federal legislation is harder for an individual legislator, except for maybe Manchin, right? If you're the one pivotal person, maybe you can take credit. But this is also with many of the state economic development programs. There's some programs that are actually really high quality, like business services. Like, you show a small business how to become an exporter. That's really highly value added. It's hard to see, right? It's not like a really exciting topic, but it matters and it's low cost, right? Workforce development, where you're actually investing in the workforce. It's portable, it helps people directly. But again, it's not the same kind of ribbon cutting ceremony. So the programs that I'm talking about are these very visible individual projects. Now, when we talk about like consumer subsidies or other types of incentives, that's not directly in my research area. But what's interesting is, you said red states, blue states, we just don't really find a partisan pattern. If anything, we find it's incumbents. So the challengers will say, you've screwed everything over, right? You've destroyed our state by giving away the tax abatements. They'll go in and change the name of the program or some nominal changes, but it's really incumbents. And we actually see this pretty consistent pattern of Democrat and Republican. What's the interesting part, and maybe this goes back to the first question, the biggest criticism are from the far right and the far left of these programs. And in Texas, there's this wall of like well-paid developers, and it was me presenting my research and two think tanks, our right-wing and our left-wing think tank in the state. So it's interesting that the progressives, both post Amazon HQ2 to some extent, but a lot of the Tea Party Republicans have this common concern. So that's why it's in particular, like you just don't see this red state, blue state pattern. Did that answer your question? I'm not sure. Yeah.
So I would imagine if I'm a politician, it would be hard for me to say, let's go from 10 down to 5, or let's remove these altogether. But it might be more palatable if I say, we have to have these things, or we should have these things, but there's better forms and there's worse forms. It's at least an easier selling point to say, we've been doing this in the past, and I've been reading Nate's book, and it tells me that I shouldn't be doing X, Y, and Z. So what are the healthier forms of when this takes place? And what is the mechanism that differentiates between the healthier or unhealthier versions?
Yeah, so I mean, the broadest, like what a healthier version is actually what the European Union did to some extent, that you have state aid rules. You literally set rules across countries. Now, they're actually talking about lifting these rules, partially because of US federal subsidies and semiconductors. But one idea is federal government action somehow limiting. And there's a movement across states, mostly from Democrats, but a few Republicans, of having non-compete clauses across states. So don't poach jobs from one state to another. So if you wiped out some of that kind of incentives, right? But the other is at the programmatic level, like what are the better programs? Actually, small business programs. Like if you could make a change, right? And a lot of the programs are the opposite of this. Like the Kansas program I told, the Panasonic, you have to invest $1 billion to qualify. So you would think you would want the opposite. And the other is just community by community. What are your needs? Austin needs affordable housing. Some communities need, grocery stores because of food deserts. Rural areas, healthcare, this really popped up. So the economic development programs that, maybe this seems super obvious, that actually map onto community needs. And there's a lot of evidence that a lot of state and city economic development plans don't even have a clear goal, right? We want investment. It's like, why do you want investment? In what industry? So I don't know if that answers your question, but a better mapping of the two.
Maybe just one clarification question. So with the smaller organizations, the small businesses, is it
with the smaller businesses, is it the same type of incentive, or is it a different size and a different type of incentive?
Yeah, so tax incentives are the worst of all possible incentives, just because they're over a long time horizon. And there's a lot of research that the discount rates are actually pretty high. So you're going to give, what Amazon HQ2 got an offer from one of the Dallas suburbs, a 99-year tax abatement to be at the airport. Like, who wants to be at the airport for like an hour, right? 99 years. Point is that there's no way Amazon is taking that into account, right? They're thinking about the first 5 or 7 years or the discount. Right? So you're just burning money. If they take that offer, you've burned decades of money. So the idea is the more upfront, the incentives, the better. So a cash grant to small businesses, as much as that sounds kind of weird, that's much better with clawbacks, with provisions, but upfront incentives to small business are much more effective. Now it's much more politically convenient to offer long tax abatements. Again, TIFs of 23 years, that's madness, right? That is madness. So 10 years at most, 5 years maybe. But the other thing about a cash grant is it has to be on your budget. Right. And I think that's actually good governance as well, as opposed to being able to offer as many tax abatements as possible. Yeah.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. That was great, Nate. Actually, very interesting. And my question kind of got asked already, but I'm going to phrase it in a different way. I was curious about the cases when it doesn't happen, when people are able to stop it from happening. And I guess what I'm wondering is whether it's become more, what's the temporal dimension? Has it become more prevalent over time, or is it easier for people to stop it by any way? Or is it more likely we're going to have these things going on even more common now than they used to be?
Yeah. So if you asked me this question 5 years ago, I'd say that there's some momentum. Actually, after 2017, Amazon HQ2, all these cities put in bids, and there's a lot of criticism of that process, a lot of criticism of the communities hiding their bids. And there was a bit of, mostly on the left, some organization against these. We fast forward, and sports stadiums, film incentives, but honestly, like the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. In Europe, there's a bunch of kind of CHIPS Acts. So the rise of industrial policy, which actually could have some real big benefits, but the form it's taking is this exact bad form of incentive. So like industrial policy is great in a lot of ways. Don't give tax abatements to BP, right? As part of that industrial policy, which is literally BP owns a bunch of the renewable energy in Texas, right? So they're getting incentives through the IRA and state and local government to subsidize the rest of their business, right? And there's better ways to do that.
So I just want to follow up on the previous question where you talked about best practices or better, at least better ways to do this. So front load incentives for small businesses, right? In the survey evidence you have, which seemed to be a key part of the argument for credit claiming, which is that voters everywhere reward you for ribbon cutting ceremonies, right? Regardless of the cost. Did the survey evidence compare value of credit claiming for short-term incentives for small businesses as compared to billion-dollar one-off deals for a company? And if so, was there evidence to suggest you don't get much credit for the first, but you do get it for the second?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's something that we didn't include in the surveys, but talking to economic developers as part of interviews, they're like, no, big wins matter, right? And it actually can matter by the company, right? Getting a really marquee, well-known company. Sometimes country of origin can matter. You might have noticed that Virginia rejected an EV battery plant that was partly Chinese owned, right? So you can imagine country, but we did some evidence on that. We didn't find that much country of origin. It is size, right? At least the preliminary evidence is that it's the size, these big wins where you can talk about 1,000 jobs, which again is unfortunate. This is, think about incubators that generate lots of jobs and maybe are really successful, but I think a lot harder, and it's not as immediate, right? These incubators, it might be 5 years down the road that you see its success, but your election was 2 years from now. So yeah, that's the negative. Like the logic is these, there's a saying in economic development, shoot at everything that flies, claim everything that falls, right? But in particularly buffalo hunting is what they call it, right? The big wins that are really well known that you can put out in a press release, right? As opposed to small. So again, that's the tough political logic of this. The best practices deviate from political best practice. Does that answer yours?
Yeah, it makes sense. Again, it'd be cool if there were survey evidence where you said I can get, we did maybe a bunch of small projects, but in 2 sentences, I'm going to tell you that equates to 1,000 jobs, whether you get more or less credit from voters.
Yeah, I have not done that, and I actually would like to do that. That's a great point. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Nate. My question is, do you have research that these economic development agencies know that the cities are really not making off and are not really benefiting as much from these tax incentives as they say they are? Is that the research that you've found that a lot of the
so that the agencies, what do they know about
promoting these?
There's not a lot of direct research on the actual economic development agencies. And honestly, a lot of them are not open to public records requests. This is why Amazon HQ2, I tried to get our proposal from a mayor's office in Austin, and they said, we don't have the proposal. And I was like, what do you mean you don't have the proposal? We wrote it in the Chamber of Commerce's office. It's there on their computer, and you have to ask them for it, and they're not subject. So it turns out the studying of these economic development agencies, particularly the public-private partnerships, are difficult. So the only thing we know is from some of these like whistleblower cases, some legal cases. New Jersey's the best one. Georgia has some of this evidence as well. So some of the state audits they've gone in, but nothing really systemic from the academic side.
And then you mentioned the St. Louis with the TIF audit.
Yeah,
showed discrepancies there.
Yeah, I mean, discrepancy is a nice way to put it. Structural problems. I mean, again, if you had to identify worst practices, it hits a bunch of them, right? To be perfect, at least at the 2020 stage. So, and again, if you magic wand, what's one thing you can do? You make all the data public. You make the applications public. You make the contracts public, and you have an audit what the company pays for on their own. And the results of that audit goes on a website. This is what the city of Austin does. This is one of the big programs in Texas that actually collapsed because of criticism, and it's because the data was available. And other programs that look quite good. There's actually a California incentive program that, of all the studies, that popped up the best, right? And I asked some people who, it's like, how is that possible? They all are pretty bad, right? This is California Competes. And I talked to one of the researchers and they said, I think they have really good staff that really tries to vet which companies, but also they target small companies. But all their data is online. So do your own study on it, right? But the point is, you know, if you're hiding the data, that alone really limits what you can learn about these programs.
Thanks, Nate. Thank you so much for that talk. Two questions. The first is, I understand it in the wild, right? If you have incumbent politicians and businesses aligned on this message that these incentives are great things, that's hard to break through in terms of public opinion. I'm just curious about in the survey work, whether you've tried anything where you just give respondents that information, and whether there's any receptiveness there. It's sort of a reformulation of Molly's question. And then second, I've already had a request can you plug your book and just give us the title of the book and remind us of that.
I'll show you what the real cover and the alternative cover is. Yeah, so there's the book, Incentives of Pander, and we actually do some non-US work. We actually look in Vietnam. So we look at even non-democratic regimes that if you want to get promoted and show you've done economic development work, and we find actually that in Vietnam, subnational politicians who are retiring put in a lot less effort in giving economic development incentives than those that are trying to get promoted. So that's like the quick plug of the book, right? It's not just US. And in the survey work, the one thing that we did in the survey, and maybe again, this goes back to the original question of how to reform. One thing we did do is, you know, you could put the biggest sticker price possible, say $1 billion, $5 billion, whatever that incentive number, that does not move public opinion at all. The only thing that moves public opinion are the trade-offs, right? And actually a bunch of NGOs are starting to do this. This is how many firefighters and school teachers you could hire with this money. This is how much of our budget as a percentage. So most of these tax abatements, most across states affect schools. So there's been a number of NGOs documenting this is not $1 billion. This is 20% of our school budget. So that's the one thing, and we see that directly in our survey research, that is the one thing that neutralizes some of this. But we also see this as activists in the real world. The hard thing is, again, is like, there's only so many of me or so many NGOs. Governor's press releases, right? Announce, and many of the business journals, I'd be curious if you looked at business journals here, they cut and paste from the press release, the governor's press release. So you get the dollar amount and the incentives, but you don't know any of the trade-offs. So yeah, that's the one thing I can say from the survey research, that the trade-offs in kind of anchored in real terms seem to really matter. Yeah, good question. Yeah. We're to Zoom questions here. Is that the?
Do you have any examples of smaller companies that have received incentives and were success stories?
Oh yeah, I mean, there are tons of small businesses, and in particular, you know, so there's like incubators and accelerators. What's kind of the exciting research is rural incubators. So you take rural areas where someone is a farmer, right? Or you take there's some like kind of lower skilled manufacturing going on in a rural area, and they actually have very little access to capital, but they also have very little expertise, right? So actually building these little incubators. In Austin, there's a fashion incubator, which maybe sounds kind of weird, right? But it turns out it's a really high value industry, but it's capital intensive up front. So if you want to make clothing, you buy your own materials, you buy your own machinery, you make a couple patterns, maybe a boutique buys it, and then you scale up and make more of it. So there's a incubator where they have the equipment. So you literally can use the equipment for free, and it's part of one of our community colleges that has a fashion program. So the point is, there are a bunch of these in particular with small businesses, and this is where I don't know if it scales in the sense like this is going to solve economic development, but if you're going to put money in something, rural economic development incubators and accelerators are pretty good. And again, because it's so underutilized. Yeah.
So if I hear you right, what I'm hearing, the problem with this is that TIFs are used because, and the problem with them is because they are taken away from the public's good, right? If we expect to give you a TIF for how many years, we expect you to give back to the public good via employment or whatever. I think that there in St. Louis, there's also a problem, and we're sitting in it, really. And the other one's over on Grand. The endowments for a lot of the universities take away from the public good because they have all these massive land holdings, and they have billions of dollars in their endowments. They don't need we've given the non-for-profits. Do you have research on that?
Yeah. So some of the stuff that I'd point you to is there's some research on anchor institutions. And it's often universities, but these can be healthcare, could be an NFL team, it could be a major company, and the way in which that they can revitalize areas. So Penn is often the classic example, but Cleveland Clinic is another example where you see it. Again, I don't know if that directly gets that question, but the way, how can a university have an impact, right? Again, one is like, you know, obviously they're not paying taxes on a lot of the land, but you have incredible procurement opportunities, right? You can buy from local businesses and you can buy in a way that has major impact. So there's a large literature, not directly what I work in, but on anchor institutions, and universities are central. But again, going to rural, smaller communities, community colleges, right, are these underutilized assets. Again, they're tax exempt, right? So it's not taxation directly that's necessarily going to benefit, but there's a lot of other potential. So that's what I would say. And I'm happy to, you know, again, but the anchor institutions are the kind of code name. And there's some really good research on this. Yeah, great question.
Great. Well, if we have no further questions, let me again thank all of you for being a really wonderful audience here today. And thank you to Nate Jensen for this fantastic talk. Let's show him our thanks.
Thank you.